Hello, I'm James Gardiner, and this is my presentation on my final project of university. This project was to create a Rust calculation app. So this will take an input, which will be a name, so that's the name of the item, and then a numerical input, which will be how many of that item will you be wanting to make, and then it will display the amount of materials needed to make that item. So for instance, if I search with no inputs at all, it will just search the database with an item multiplication of 1. So that's saying one of those items are going to be made. As you can see, all of these items are listed in the JSON. So if I search for an item, so let's say wood, so this will now search for all the items that contain the word wood in them. That is achieved by converting this user input into uppercase, and the word that it's searching for in the JSON, it will also convert it to uppercase. Then it will compare the two, and that will return the correct item. And I've done it using that method because it will reduce human error, since it's not going to be case sensitive. It only needs to be spelt correctly. I've also made it so if you enter 0, it also calculate by 1, as you can see there. But it does increase if searching for a higher value. From this, I was making a login system. This login system, you can enter a username, so I'll enter my name, James Gardiner, enter a password. So you have to re-enter the password, and before it submits and sends it to the database, it checks the two to see if they're the same, and if they are, it will be submitted, and you can enter your account. Here it will display your name, and it will show the saved items. Unfortunately, you aren't able to save items because that was a bit too challenging for me from the way I was creating the data. Since let's explain that. So when searching for an item, it will display numerous amounts of iterations of a loop, and I didn't know how to get the data from that loop, from that iteration of the loop, and save it in a format that you can then send to a database. That was my main issue for saved items. I am still looking into it as we speak, but I haven't had any luck. When sending your passwords to the database, the system hashes the password, and this will make it so if a user or a hacker manages to get user data, it will be extremely hard for them to decrypt that data, so they can't access the account. And if you want to check, here is my username and password, and submit. That has entered the database. There we go. To achieve this, the first stage in my development was the analysis phase. I didn't do much analysis, but what I did was a lot of critical analysis. So this involved me going to various websites that do not a similar thing but are gaming related. This would be websites for actually Rust's website. You have League of Legends, Smites, lots of various games, to see how they would lay out their page in terms of colour, layout, positioning of elements, and what pages they would have. Other pages I also looked at with pages such as Smitefire and a team builder for a game called Teamfight Tactics. This gave you an idea of what people would like to see and what works, and this helped me implement my designs. Speaking of the designs, I then started on the design phase of the project. I didn't do a huge amount of design, when I really should have. But the tools I used for designing were two websites, one called Coolers and one called Usard. Coolers was a website that I could create colour palettes on. So this allowed me to see all the colours side by side, so I can select what looks good and then edit a colour based off of what I could see on the screen. And this was extremely useful, as I could then adjust what I needed. For example, I ended up adjusting my first colour palette as I thought the colours I originally used didn't contrast as well as my second palette, and I could see that without having to alter my colour scheme mid-development. Usard was a tool that I used to create wireframes. So a wireframe is just a very basic form of what the website's going to look like without adding functionality to the website. So this allowed me to make the various pages that I wanted and positioning of those elements on the page, as well as different formats such as desktop, tablet, and mobile phone, portrait and landscape modes. So they are very useful. So when you start development, you know what the website's going to look like, instead of going in gung-ho and guessing what it should look like. The next stage was the implementation stage. So the first bit of functionality that I added to the website was the JSON data extraction. Now this was very complicated, as I hadn't really worked with JSON data before. I'd done assignments for university for REST API, but I hadn't created my own JSON before. So creating the JSON and then trying to work with it was a real challenge. For example, I could create the data for each item, but then creating a nested object for each item, then accessing it to get the correct data, I found to be quite difficult. I tried various different methods by making the JSON object an actual array and creating nested objects within the nested object, and those didn't work, as I was getting the values from the object based off of the keys, the JSON key. But once I got the value, and once I had concatenated the two values for the item name and item cost, it would come up with object. The word was just object, and I couldn't convert the object into text without it looking extremely messy, and then it would overly complicate the code. So what I did was I ended up realizing I could just create two arrays, and then I could loop through those arrays since they'll be the same size. So I'll be looping by array.length, and this worked great. For the login system, I used hashed passwords, as I covered before. But two aspects that I wanted to include that I hadn't included was SQL injection prevention and XSS attacks. So SQL injection would be injecting SQL queries into into a system using a text box, and that would be used to retrieve data from a system. So this would be used during the login portion of the system. Then they could potentially access the database to extract data from the user's login tables, which is extremely bad. And I hadn't implemented a way to resolve that. I have an idea how, and that can be by escaping your values, removing inputs from the form on submission, so users can't just type plain text, and those sorts of methods I needed to implement but hadn't. This is the same concept for XSS attacks, and just removing special characters so they can't inject JavaScript into your website to perform malicious attacks. Now, I had planned features for the website, such as implementing the saved items, as I covered before, but I wasn't able to achieve that for complications that I couldn't figure out how to overcome, unfortunately. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.